Exciting news! Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, Court 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. Today, I'm very pleased to have as my guest Dr. Marty Shoemaker. Dr. Shoemaker was born and raised in California in a very religious evangelical environment. While attending graduate school for clinical psychology at Fuller Seminary, his faith was fragmented by studying theology and secular psychology at the same time. At age 25, Marty left the church behind and moved fully into secular science, finishing his PhD in clinical psychology. About 30 years ago, Marty discovered humanism through a group of like-minded secular friends in Canada. Yay, Canada! After exploring various renditions of the Humanist Manifesto by the AHA, Marty was hooked. After further research, he began to identify himself as a humanist and eventually joined the BC Humanist Association. For the last 8 years, Marty has volunteered as a humanist chaplain in British Columbia, which is where we met at a local event for atheists, skeptics, and humanists. Welcome, Marty. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be with you and talk about something very dear to both of our hearts, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it sounds like we have similar backgrounds coming out of evangelicalism. Of course, I was in BC growing up, steeped in it, and you were in California. And then you found your way out of it and went all the way from being an evangelical Christian into being a clinical psychologist and humanist. And I just find that so fascinating. I'd love for you to share some of your journey with us.
Well, I've been writing a little bit about my autobiography, and I've also had two really wonderful conversations with my older brother, who has been an evangelical minister for over 50 years.
Wow.
But he's a very loving guy, and I began to share with him some of the historical antecedents that began to happen that had me leave the church, because he knows that I'm secular. He knows I'm a humanist chaplain now. He knows I left the church. And for the most part, he's been, fairly supportive other than my theology. And we've had some very good heart-to-heart conversations together. And so those events, plus the writing, has made this very fresh in my mind. And you are correct. I was raised in Southern California, which, if you look at some of the contextual things, there are some early precedents that happened in my life that I began to set the stage for me to question the way I was raised.
All right.
And I could have been raised Catholic. I could have been raised in another religion, and I probably would have had some similar experiences. And I'll share some of these with your listeners. And one of them is the fact that Southern California, where I was raised in Pasadena, which is northeast of Los Angeles by about 15 miles. It's known for its Rose Bowl and its Rose Parade. And I played in the Rose Bowl my high school football games.
Cool.
But it's a very pluralistic city. It was a moderately sized city when I was there, about 60,000. But because it was outside of LA and it had some older districts that minorities could move into, we had a Black area. We had a lot of Black athletes that I played sports with. I partied with them. We had Chicanos, we had Hispanic, we had Asians. And although the school was predominantly Caucasian and middle class, I got an exposure to a lot of other different points of view, not so much religiously, but in terms of their cultures and in terms of the way they enjoyed life, particularly when I would go over to a party. One of my Black basketball teammates, and it would be totally different than the kind of church parties I went to.
Yeah, I bet.
Oh, yeah. Very different. Yeah, particularly when the door would close and they would hang their baseball hat on the door, means don't come in here because something's happening here that's very private.
Right.
Trust me, being raised in a very conservative church where you didn't have sex until you were married, that alone was very different.
Shocking. Yeah.
So I think that context of being in California, not in a small rural area or raised in some place, where your current husband's from, Mississippi, which is extremely right-winged, conservative, and church is something you don't question. And if you want to advance in your career, you have to stay in the fold. I didn't have to worry about that, given the pluralism of the context that I was raised in.
Right.
I think another important factor, and you might relate to this in your own reading about family dynamics and attachment theory, et cetera, and that is that not only was I raised in a very ethnically mixed area with lots of different religions, I was also the youngest of two sons. And if you studied your birth order research, you're very well aware, you can understand why my oldest brother, Norman, stayed in the church because he was raised in the church.
Yeah.
My parents both very active. He wanted to even be better at church than either one of my parents.
Oh, amen.
And for me, as the youngest, because he had really taken the path of being the good boy so well, I had to take another route around to try to be noticed in that family, to have a separate identity, to not just be like him.
Yeah.
And so I found all kinds of ways to bend and break the rules that he would have never tolerated. Although I think secretly he was a little jealous. So I went to secular high school. I played in secular athletics. I had secular girlfriends. He never had any of that experience at all. So I think being in a pluralistic part of the United States and being a youngest son, in contrast to this very straight arrow older brother, set me on a path to question and sometimes be not openly criminally type rebellious or terribly cruelly rebellious, but certainly intellectually, behaviorally, and with my social group that I attached to. They were very different than what my brother had.
Wow.
And that got me on a path to question my own religious tradition.
Would your parents get on your back about it?
Well, my mother and father had extremely different personalities. My father was born as an only child, and his father went to World War I and basically deserted them. And he was raised without a father figure. And actually, without going into too much detail and invading the privacy of stories that my father told me, he was raised by a teenage mother that was, to survive, had to go out and date men that could buy things and do things. And some of these men were not very nice.
Right.
Okay. They were taking advantage of a beautiful, young, 18, 19, 20-year-old. She was 17 when he was born. Wow. So he was raised in an atmosphere without a loving father, without a good father image. And most of the men he met were losers. And as a result of that, his masculinity was always in question. And I'll tell you a little bit later, a story he told me when he wanted to give me my first sex lecture will tell you very much about maybe one of the most determining factors that how I was raised, and it had to do with sexual ethics and the way he approached that.
Wow.
So my mother, on the other hand, Janice, was a farm girl born in Texas who was tough as nails.
Wow.
And you didn't mess with my mom.
Mhm.
You didn't mess with her.
Mhm.
And as the youngest child, because I wanted on occasion to take her on, I usually got slapped. And I usually was put in the corner. And I was the one that was grounded. And my brother would just kind of laugh and say, I told you that would happen if you said that.
Right.
And so she was not an easy woman to love.
Mhm.
She loved me, but she was so tough at times that, and given my youngest brother pattern, she was after me all the time.
Oh boy.
And I actually think that she had been told when she was a couple months pregnant that they thought, based on heart rate, that I was a girl because I had very low heart rate. And she actually got a name out. She bought dresses. She was going to name me Gracie. And I am thankful. Whoever in the cosmos set up my DNA allowed me to be a boy. Because if I'd been raised by my mother as a girl, I might not be talking to you today. Because she would have been really tough on anybody that was going to wander off her religious path.
That's right.
And I didn't know some of her background when she was raising us. She was, of course, secretive about that and private about that. But later, after I became a psychologist, I began to ask her more about her childhood. And I began to develop a context. And I began to feel compassion for her because her father beat her. He never sexually abused her, but he beat her. He would, when she didn't pick enough cotton, she was picking cotton at 4, 5, and 6 years old. He would say, go out to the peach tree and get a stick. And then he'd whip them. So she was really beat up as a child. She was scared, and she was scared to go against the rules of the day in her family. And she was the oldest girl in the family, and the youngest girl, who was like 6 or 7 years younger than her, rebelled and ended up dying. Are you ready for this? On the abortion table, having a illegitimate child by a racing car star in LA. And her parents would not tolerate any of that. So my mother almost had to raise another child that she had. So my mother also was fortunate because she did stay in the church, because had she gone the other route, who knows what would have happened in her family. Her father was a tyrant. He would have been in the KKK if he had stayed in Alabama. He was one real white supremacist black hater. And I grew up with a mother who was trying to challenge that and be a little more humane, but her racism came through all the time. Little subtle things. When I'd bring a black kid home to have dinner with us, she would say, why did you invite Leon? Why don't you invite Mark? He will like the food I fix. You know, so there were little things like that that I was raised with. So their different personalities gave me opposites. And at times, I liked my father's kindness, but I liked my mother's feistiness. She would stand up and fight you and fight the neighbors and fight anybody else that messed with her. So I think I inherited a little bit of both sides. I'd like to think that I'm an assertive, nice guy. I'll leave that for others to judge.
That's what I think. That's been my experience of you.
Yeah. Thank you. And it suits, I think, sometimes the path that I chose, which was to be a university professor and to have a practice, because I would take stands and be able to lecture and do things like that comfortably, being verbal and somewhat extroverted. I think that another important contextual thing, Janice, that would go into the story here, besides the pluralism, having very opposite parents, and I'm the youngest child who's going to find a semi-rebellious route out of the family, is that I was raised in a church that was a break-off from the Methodist church out west, and it was what was known as the Church of the Nazarene.
Oh, yeah.
Not very big in Canada, but it's very big in the western part of the United States.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the holiness churches, which means they believe in a second work of grace. You not only are saved by claiming Jesus Christ as your Savior, but you must invite the Holy Spirit into your life. And this Holy Spirit remove what they called the bent to sin,
Okay.
the leaning to sin, right? And so I was raised that way. And I went to the altar a number of times because I was a very imperfect kid. You know, I did things that I knew weren't right.
You had lots to confess.
Go and pray and all that. And when I invited the Holy Spirit into my life to take away my desire to do things with girls or masturbate or, you know, look at a dirty picture or maybe cheat a little bit on a test, it hadn't been removed, even though I asked the Holy Spirit to take away this bent to sin.
Right.
It was still there. You know? So I said, well, I must be either imperfect or this is pretty bad theology. It could be either one of those. And given my life pattern, I'm going to question it as much as just blame myself.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was the context that I was raised in. And one of the things that's important to understand about churches like the Nazarene and the other holiness churches is that most of them, because they were founded and developed in the West during the late 18th century and early 19th century, then most of their rules that had to do with being a good Christian, this manual that I was supposed to read, were what I call later, when I began to study social and intellectual history of the United States, was what was called anti-saloon theology.
Anti-saloon theology.
Anti-saloon theology is anything that happens in the saloon is sinful.
Oh, boy.
And then the other side is the people that go to church on Sunday, have the picnics with the church people, never go to the saloon. And then in the middle, you have the merchants, the mayor, and the sheriff, who are kind of trying to ride both sides.
Yeah.
So what happens in the saloon? Dancing.
Every fun thing.
Drinking. A little flirting. Possibly going upstairs for a little commodity sex. For even in our manual, it was sin to spit.
Oh, yes.
Because of the spittoon, right? And we weren't even allowed to read the newspaper on Sunday because in saloon behavior, that's what they did. They'd wake up and get up, and in the morning, they would go to the saloon at 10 o'clock, and the bartender would have papers out for them to read. So reading the paper on Sunday was a sin in my family.
Wow. I think my mom used to say, don't drink, smoke, or chew, or run with those who do.
Yeah, all of those things. The anti-saloon. And when I later studied this in university and history, even before I went to seminary, I saw the context for all these rules. I've always been interested about why certain things get put into law or why certain cultures develop things. And when you read about it, you realize there's all kinds of interesting historical roots to these things. And I'm going to say, well, of course, the saloon. That's why we can't do all these things. Because my other Christian friends, Presbyterians and Baptists and Catholics, they all danced and they did a lot of, they had a little glass of wine, a little beer. And I'm saying, but I can't do that. Why is that? But you guys say you're Christians. Yeah. And this was really challenged later in my life when after I graduated from university and I ended up tearing my knee up and I couldn't play professional sports. So I decided to teach for a while. And I took a job in Harlem, New York, which is the largest ghetto in the United States, black ghetto,
right,
in the middle 60s. And I taught school. And the other teachers there all came from liberal Christian schools like Princeton and Harvard and Yale and Penn State. And they all had girlfriends. They all slept with their girlfriends. They all drank. They smoked a little dope. And they were good Christians. And I'm going, what? You guys are good Christians? And I can't do any of those things.
Right.
Right? So I began to see that Christianity was a big category.
Yes.
And that I was raised a very specific way. Right? So I think that is the reason why when I finally went away to seminary and because I decided to become a psychologist after my experiences in Harlem, and I saw how much disturbed, and I had students that committed suicide, overdosed. I just felt they were underserved psychologically. I had also an experience as a youth pastor. For 2 years, I was youth pastor when I came back from Harlem, and I had an experience that changed me and sealed the deal on me going into some kind of mental health area. And that was about 6 months after taking this job. They'd run some ads in the paper about things that I'm doing. They had my picture in the paper. And all of a sudden, I began getting people coming that wanted to counsel with me, right? And they were just from the neighborhood, right? And they were women that wanted to flirt with me. And then there was this young, skinny boy, pimply, glasses, not a very attractive man at all. And he came in and he said he wanted to talk to me. He was depressed and all this kind of stuff. And after a few meetings with him, I put two and two together. And I said to him, I don't really think you're interested in me counseling you. And I'm not a psychologist anyway. My sense is you're here for a personal relationship with me. And he said, are you gay? And I said, no, we didn't use the word cisgender back then.
Right.
He said, no, I'm heterosexual. I date women and I like women. And I'm going to marry a woman. And so he left. 2 weeks later, I picked up the Star News, which was the paper in my town. And they had found his body in the pool at Pasadena City College. He had drowned himself on an OD on drugs. And I felt responsible. I felt I hadn't done him the kind of advice that he needed. And rather than just say, no, I'm not interested in a personal relationship, I should have somehow referred him to maybe a gay clinic or a doctor, or somebody that could work with him, his depression and his gender struggles. And I didn't do that. And I felt responsible. And so that was one of the things that sealed the deal for me to go into psychology.
Wow. That is powerful.
Yeah, it was a very powerful experience. I've never forgotten it.
And then you actually were taking your PhD at Fuller. Is that right?
Right. I chose to go to a school. I thought I'd go into psychiatry, but then I looked at all the curriculum and my doctor friends that I'd gone to school with said, all we do is have fat fights in the lab. If you want to be a psychiatrist, you need to go another route. And somebody suggested Fuller, which was a integration of a PhD in clinical psych and a master's in theology. And I was riding this fence. I was interested in science and all this stuff and why things happen. And yet on the other side, I was interested in a more liberal theology and why was theology the way it was. I wanted to kind of study it, to actually understand my background and how it turned out the way it was. And were there other alternatives? How come these guys from Princeton had all these other advantages that I didn't have?
Right.
So I chose that school. And after a year of studying, reading liberal theology, one book, maybe some of your listeners have read it, was an incredibly popular book. And it was called Honest to God by Bishop Robinson. And I read that book, and he asked all of the penetrating questions. The Odyssey, like, how can a loving God send so many people to their doom and to hell? And a bunch of other questions about the authenticity of the scriptures. And if Jesus raised from the dead, how come he only preached the kingdom of God, and it was going to come, and it was going to come soon, but it never did. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of really tough questions. Mm-hmm. And after reading this, I think emotionally it was liberating to me to think maybe some of the things I believe are not true, particularly all the saloon rules. Mm-hmm. Like, I like to dance, I like to drink, and I wanted to have some sex. And those were all the rules that were forbidden. So I think emotionally, to read a book that questioned my saloon upbringing, anti-saloon upbringing, was very liberating. Mm-hmm. So most of my energy then switched over to the other side of the street, which was the psych school. And I just did the theology to get the master's degree and move on. I didn't really have my heart in it. And it was there that I did my final separation, kind of an intellectual and emotional parting of the ways. Mm-hmm. And I left the church, never went back other than for the odd wedding or funeral or something like that.
And did you find it, emotionally difficult to kind of cut those ties or release the belief that you'd had pretty much all your life? As you put it, the saloon theology. Was that hard for you to do?
Well, like most big changes you make in your life, I had emotions on both sides. Mm-hmm. But I have to honestly say, and I would like your listeners to know this, I never really experienced religious trauma as you think about it.
Okay.
There were some screwy things that happened, but I would not call them traumatizing. Most of those, because I was fortunate. I was 6'3", 215 pounds, right. A white male that was privileged. People didn't mess with me as a general rule. Mm-hmm. Right. And the other thing around that was that I had always had an intellectual curiosity about things. And so I think a lot of that break was I viewed it as intellectual and that this didn't make any sense anymore. Mm-hmm. That was not traumatic because I was also taught to think. I went to a large urban church, and a lot of my Sunday school classes were taught by profs at the college that was just up the street. And they taught very intellectual views of religion, not just blind faith. So I was taught to think.
Wow.
So if you ask me about trauma, I would say that the only real kind of, I won't even call it trauma. I would say disturbing at the time.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you the way I handled it. Is I was standing in the edge of the kitchen. My mother was making breakfast. And this was the last year that I stayed home because I needed to go and be on my own after all this happened.
So how old were you?
The last few months that I was there. And my mother was asking me questions about what I was learning in theology and questioning. And I told her about this book that I had been reading, and Bultmann, who was, kind of an existential theologian who thought it was all contextual, the New Testament. And I said, well, there are a lot of really bright people, Mom, that don't necessarily buy into the fact that Jesus was divine. He's a pretty nice guy, but we don't know if he's divine, and we don't even know what we can believe. Mm. She walked to me. I was standing by the furnace. She looked me in the face from her little hallway position and said, "Are you telling me you don't believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God?" Mm. And I said, "Well, Mom, I'm not the only one that might have some doubts about this. Mm-hmm. There's some very smart dudes and women out there that are questioning this, and you've never read them, but I have." She walked in right in the small hallway, fell down on her knees, put her head in between her legs, started this hysterical act of saying, "Marty, you're killing me. You're killing me."
Wow.
So Now you can say, well, was that traumatizing? I'm going to tell you how I reacted. Because I was in therapy at the same time, and I'd already started this process of objectifying and seeing some need to individuate away from my parents.
Right.
And this therapist was very aware of my mother because he was in the same church. He knew my father, he knew my mother.
Okay.
And he had said to me, well, if you start sharing some of your journey, you're going to have some challenges. And so I was all prepared for this. And she is down on the floor, head in between her legs, in this hysterical kind of act, right? Because I call it an act. I put my hand on the back of her neck, not hard, just rested it.
Right.
And I said, Mom, if me being honest with you about what I'm learning in seminary is going to kill you, you're just going to have to die.
Did you really say that?
I said that.
Wow.
I said that.
Yeah.
You got to remember, I had a history with this woman, okay?
Of course.
We had been at odds on a number of occasions. This isn't the first time.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And so this is how I know it was an act. She paused, lifted her head up, stood up, looked at me, and went right back into the kitchen and didn't speak to me the rest of the day. So this was drama.
It was.
This was drama.
Yeah, histrionic, to be sure.
She was going down to the bottom of the barrel to try to think that if she had been crushed by my revelation of my journey, that I was doing her irreparable damage. But it was drama.
Wow. I love your forthrightness in that instance. And as you say, you knew her very, very well. You know her buttons. She knew your buttons.
What's great about the story, Janice, though, is that later, after I became a psychologist and began to understand her story better, I actually ended up having a better relationship with her than my brother did.
Wow.
Because he was still under her control.
Right.
Emotionally.
Yes.
She had manipulated him enough through his life that he had a real hard time separating out, particularly since he stayed in the church and wanted to be a good Christian son. Yeah. I had already started to make that break. And so I wasn't in any kind of allegiance to the system anymore. Right.
That's right.
And as she began to reveal her story to me, her own trauma and the things that she was raised with, I just felt compassion for her. I'd give her hugs and I said, you should have told me this a long time ago. We'd have got along better.
Oh, wow. Well, you mentioned a little bit ago about a talk that your father gave you around sexuality. Yeah. And I've got something on the horizon, which is the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture Conference. So I am very interested if you would share that story with us.
Okay. I'd be happy to do that because I think it is one of the critical events that I had in my relationship with a Christian man, my father. And the background of this is that you got to remember he was very kind, passive, never confrontive, because he had his own doubts about masculinity and about being assertive. So people to church, because he never said an unkind word, and he would do anything for you because he didn't want to say no. And so therefore, smart people kind of saw through this, like my therapist. But I was raised by people who would say to me, God, if you turn out like your father, Marty, you're going to be one wonderful Christian example. All my life, I've been told this in the church.
Wow.
Okay. But the event in question that has to do back when I was about 14, my father had come out from Michigan in a car with his aunt and uncle and lived in Pasadena, not far from the church. And it was during the Depression. It was 1929. And so nobody had any money. Nobody had any work. They were struggling. He would talk to me about how they just ate milk and tomatoes with sugar on them all day long because they could buy a whole bunch of tomatoes and buy milk. And that's what they would eat. They didn't have a balanced diet because they didn't have enough money.
Right.
So he found a job He was about 18. He was 16 when he came out, but a couple of years later, in the middle of the Depression, it'll be 1931, he's 18 years old, and he takes a job as an elevator operator in a business, a corporate building in downtown LA. Mm-hmm. And this is, back in the 30s. So it wasn't a big, tall building like 30 stories. It was like 15 stories, right?
Sure.
So he's doing the elevator thing at night. And this is the story he told me. I'm riding home with him, Yosemite. I want to ride with my brother in his brand new Chevy, 52 Chevy. He said, no, you're riding with me. Okay, so I go with my dad, and he says, I need to tell you a little bit about something that happened to me when I was 18 years old. I was an elevator operator in an office building in Los Angeles, and it was Christmas, and there was a Christmas party, and I was taking all this people up to the top floor, and they're all partying up there. They're drinking, and they're coming down the elevator. They're drunk. I have to help them out and all this stuff. My father was a teetotaler because so many of the men that were abusive to his mother were drinkers.
Right.
And so he didn't want anything to do with booze. Mm-hmm. So he said, so I'd help him out, and then he said, just before I was off my shift at midnight, there was a buzz. I go up to the top floor, and there is a woman and two men. And they got on the elevator, and I could obviously see they were all drunk. And on the way down, these two men were groping and sexually assaulting this woman. Mm-hmm. This is his view. Mm-hmm. I'm sure they're kissing her, maybe fondling her. I have no idea exactly what they were doing. And when they got down to the bottom, she kind of, wanted to go her way and kind of pushed them to the side, and they were a little clingy. My father took these men. This is this very passive, non-aggressive man, and each one of them threw them off the elevator with a punch, knocking them onto the ground.
Wow.
The woman comes off the elevator, sees these men and what he's done to them. And he goes, you didn't have to hit them. I know how to take care of them. You didn't have to hit them. And he said, but they were harming you. She left. This is the story my father tells me about male sexuality. This is that it's out of control. Mm-hmm. That it is not monogamous, that it's just, whoever's available. Mm. And that was the example that stuck in my mind as a 14-year-old, that somehow male sexuality was out of control.
Right.
You could not control it. Mm-hmm. And you would do immoral things. If you allow your sexual instincts, your drive, whatever it might be, your attraction, you will do something to really harm the women in your life. Mm-hmm. This is the message that came by, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, how would that be corrected? Well, now, all the way through high school, I was athletic, I was tall, I was reasonably attractive. Women wanted to go out with me. We would have parties. They wanted to dance with me. Mm-hmm. Some of them would say, why don't you let me drive you home? And then they would want to make out with me. They want to do all kinds of things with me. Mm-hmm. I'm 15, 16, 17, 18. I want to kiss them, but I can't do anything else because my male inhibition and sexuality will harm them.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
That's what I grew up with.
Yeah.
The corrective experience was at USC. I was in a doctoral program in another field before I went to psychology. This is before I went to Harlem. And I was living with a guy who's still in the church. He's a lawyer. We're sort of good friends. He's got a whole other different theology than I do. But anyway, we were living together. He was a little more liberal than I was. We would drink and party a little bit together, but he never brought women up or did anything like that. Mm-hmm. So here I am. I'm 21, 22 years old. I'm down at the pool. I've been in the weight room the last 5, 6, 7 years. So I look pretty studly. And this young woman comes up to me. She's been laying in the Chase Lounge. Mm-hmm. And she says, do you live here? And she's got a French accent. She was Masoud. You live here? Mhm. And she's like 18 years old, 19 years old.
Mhm.
She's beautiful. She's in a little tiny bikini.
Mhm.
Whoa, my eyes were just feasting on it.
Yeah.
This is before I left the church, though, okay?
Right. Mhm.
And I said, yeah, no, I live here. She says, I would like to visit you in your room one time.
Oh, wow.
Can we do this? And I said, yeah, we'll come up and I'll pour you a glass of wine.
Mhm.
So a couple days later, she's down the pool and the whole thing happened. She comes up to the room.
Mhm.
I'm kind of interested in making out with her.
Right.
But I'm not going to take her clothes off or do anything like that. And so she said, she comes up, she sits on the couch. I go into the kitchen and I am pouring a glass of wine for both of us. Okay. When I come back, she's sitting on the couch with her bathing suit off.
Oh, no.
She is totally naked.
Yes. What a
Right?
shock for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't a shock as much as it was, what the hell am I going to do now? This is weird, right? It's awkward.
Yeah. Sure.
So I don't think it's like an 18-year-old boy who has an older woman who takes the clothes off. I think our age difference and a few other things, I didn't feel threatened. I just didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
And I was a bit ambivalent because I did want to make out with her, maybe touch her a little bit, but nothing, no sex. Right.
Yeah.
And I looked at her and I put the glass down and I said, I can't remember her name. And I said, I'm not going to have sex with you, my dear. I don't believe in it. I'm waiting until I am married to have sex. She gathered her bikini up, ran out the door, and as she went out the door, she was crying.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And later when I told this story to some other women friends of mine, she said she felt hurt.
Mm.
She felt totally rejected by what you did.
Mm-hmm.
The way that you did it in kind of this moral one-upmanship kind of thing, making her feel bad or whatever. Maybe she'd been raised Catholic and had been told the same thing and she wasn't following any of that. Whatever it was, that hurt her feelings. Okay. My dad tells me male sexuality has to be controlled because you will be an abusive person that has no morals if you let it go rampant. Then I have a young French girl, very liberated, naked in my house. I give my little moral spiel. She runs out crying.
Oh, no.
I've hurt her. So you see, the underlying thing here is you can hurt people a lot of different ways. One of them is being a predator. The other way is to be morally self-righteous and inferring that they're of lower moral caliber.
Oh, wow.
I learned both of those things within a couple of years.
Important lessons.
And that changed. I went to seminary then, and now I have this in my background that no, maybe male sexuality, plus all these other guys I was around, they had girlfriends, they were sleeping with them, and they were happy and all this kind of stuff. So I think that was the two events that shaped my early sexuality. And I think that then when I left the church, I began to become more sexually liberated. And I didn't feel like there was this rule thing here I had to abide by, which is to wait until you're married. So I didn't feel traumatized. I felt, in a way, when I left the church, liberated.
Yep.
In fact, I wrote a paper. I don't know. I think it was either my next to last or last year in seminary for a psych integration seminar when we were talking about sexual ethics and stuff. And I wrote the paper and it said, my burdens were lifted with the possibility of no Calvary. No Calvary. Remember, there's a song you sing, burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. For me, my burden was lifted at the possibility this was a historical myth. I wrote that paper.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That is just great. It is absolutely liberating, as you say. And those two messages that you received around male sexuality and sexuality, those are so powerful. They really influenced you. And then you moved out of Christianity. We're exploring really the secular world earnestly, and in science with psychology.
Yeah, my organizing principle then switched to the science of psychology and the practice of psychology. That became my new organizing ethical value principle, right?
Beautiful. And then at some point after you had entered that world, you discovered humanism.
Well, it took quite a while. I had studied humanism in history of Europe, and I thought humanism was a Renaissance academic stance. But I didn't know anything about it as an institutional movement in the world in terms of a community of people and the whole humanist writer heritage and all the stuff that went into the manifesto. I didn't know anything about that. I was just a secular psychologist, and I saw people. I taught in university, psych classes, rehab classes, related to what the kind of work I was doing clinically. And I never really went to church. I never was even looking for a community because Sundays were playing golf and watching football or sports or something. And I had two small kids. So we had lots to do on Sundays. I didn't miss church one bit.
Amen.
So I don't think I experienced a great loss, shall we say. I was as much liberated. Plus, a lot of the students, I should say a few of the students at Fuller, when I was there in the psych school, were on the same journey I was. So as they began to unravel their background and began to liberate, we supported each other.
Nice.
And we began to talk, how are your parents reacting? And how's this going to affect the way you do your career and a bunch of things? And we started going to, strip bars and studying, drinking wine and studying at the strip bars. And it was, so I didn't have that social context that was going to judge me. I did on occasion, not a lot, because I didn't go back to the church. But every once in a while, I'd meet somebody and they say, yeah, why don't you come over, Marty? We're having some people here. And somebody from the church, my church that I went to, would show up. And they would say, hey, I haven't seen you at church for a long time. And I would say, well, you want to know the truth? Sure. What's the truth? I left the church 3 or 4 years ago. You what? You left the church? Your whole family is such good Nazarenes, and your brothers. What do you mean you left the church? I did. It didn't make sense to me anymore. And so at the end of that conversation, as I'd go out the door and I'd say, goodbye, Charlie, they would look at me and say, Marty, so sorry to hear that you're lost.
Right.
I'll pray for you.
Right.
And I would say, don't waste your breath, man. This is the happiest time of my life. Pray for somebody who's suffering, okay? Otherwise, it's wasted effort. Then I'd leave.
And then when did you encounter humanism in the context of a kind of a philosophy?
Yeah, I don't think I ever looked for a religion to replace it. And I didn't read much theology and I didn't read much philosophy because I was raising a family. I was doing mostly psychological stuff.
Yeah.
The introduction for me happened. I came to Canada in 1981. So I've been here 41 years.
Nice.
And in Vancouver. And I knew a prof that had come from Montreal. He came from, I believe he was teaching at McGill or at University of Montreal. I can't remember which one. And he was one of the founders of the humanist group in Montreal. And he was a professor of psychology at UBC, teaching in the psych department. I don't know if you're your people follow any of the history of psychology, but his name was Dr. Ernie Poser. And he, along with Dr. Henry Mergenthaler, started the group, and also Dr. Mitra, who was an East Indian doctor. And they all got together and they started this humanist group in Montreal.
You mean the Dr. Morgenthaler?
Yeah, Dr. Morgenthaler was one of the founders of this group in Montreal. And later, in 1968, when they became a national association, he was the first president. And he'd already been in jail for all of the issues around the criminality of abortion and his breaking the laws and everything.
Yes.
So he invited me to speak in his psych class at UBC on some work I was doing on preventing chronic pain and things like that. And so he then invited me to his home afterwards. After I've got a few more classes to teach, but come by the house around 3:00 and I'll be there with Yuta. Yuta was his wife, and she was also one of the founders.
Oh, wow.
So I came and they were talking and I said, and then a couple of other faculty and staff came by and they were all drinking wine and talking, and they began to talk about their humanistic group that they had that met in his home. So I'm going, what is this, Ernie? What is this humanistic group? And he said, don't you know what humanism is? And I said, yeah, it's a Middle Ages academic position to study the Greeks and go back to ancient time and study secular literature, not just the religious gobbledygook of the Catholic Church. And he said, well, that's where it started. But we have all kinds of iterations of this through the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. And now in the United States and Canada, we have a national association. I said, really? He says, yeah, there is a group here in BC, but I don't attend it because of the time that it comes is not convenient for me. So he told me about BCHA, British Columbia Humanist Association, and they had been founded by 5 couples in the middle 80s, but they'd gone up and down and they struggled and they weren't really always meeting in the 90s. Then they kicked off again in the early 2000s and had a group that was meeting at the senior center in Oak Ridge in Vancouver, Midtown Vancouver. And so I started going to that, but it was at least 10, 15 years after I had this conversation with Ernie. Because this group was meeting on Sunday and I had too many things I wanted to do.
Right. Yes.
So I wasn't coming. So it was later that I started to attend BCHA and was on the board and put on a few lectures and things for them. So I think the real introduction for me happened when SFU, the over 55 courses, contacted Ian Bushfield, who's our executive director, and said, we'd like to have a lecturer on humanism. We usually have one every 10 years. And one of my predecessors had given it before. And he said, if you would like to send somebody to us, we'll do that. And he suggested me, since I was teaching in university. And so I went there, and then for 6 weeks, I did 2-hour lectures. And that got me reading everything I could find.
Wow.
And that began to entrench me in the canon of humanism, the history and how it grew and where it has been persecuted and where it has thrived and its modern iterations, including what we have in Canada and the United States. So that was the turning point for me. And I found great congruence with the principles of trusting science, not blank science, you know, good science and bad science. And then also that you need to be a caring individual. You need to have empathy and respect people regardless of who they are and what they've done. That was part of what you learned in psychology. You know, anybody that comes into your practice is on equal footing from the standpoint of respect and dignity.
Right.
You know, you might not agree with their lifestyle or the way they've changed in the past, or they may have a religious obsession, or they might be, you know, a Satanist that worships with the group in Surrey and they have seances and all this kind of stuff. But you want them to develop within their own value system the way. And so that fit with your whole training in psychology to be client-centered and to respect other people's place in the world, right?
Okay, yeah.
So I had a great overlap with the manifestos, and as I began to learn more about it, and I just wonder where's this been my whole life after I left the church? But it's hard to say. I have always had a lot of other things on the go, and so therefore finding a community of just believers has never been real high on my to-do list.
What would you say to folks who maybe they're exiting Christianity, or maybe they're still in Christianity, and they have this fear? They've been raised that the term, the title secular humanist is a slur. It's a bad thing that you accuse somebody of being. How would you respond to them, or how would you explain to them what humanism actually is?
Well, I run across this question quite a bit, Janice, as a humanist chaplain now at a university. And when I do some lectures and things like that, students will come up afterwards, or people in the audience, and ask me more, to nail down what the worldview really is.
Okay.
And so on my badge, it says, humanist chaplain. And many of the students don't know what either one of those things is.
Right. Yes.
What a humanist is and what a chaplain is. So I have developed kind of spontaneous interaction with people to talk about the worldview of humanism from my lectures, and I try to reduce it down to a couple of good sentences, and that's what it is. But if they're afraid of humanism, I would ask them, what are you afraid of? What is it about being a science advocate, compassionate, appreciating the arts, and wanting to have a humanistic value system where everybody's worth dignity? What is frightening about that? And they'll say, well, you don't believe in God. And I said, what makes you think that? Well, everything I've ever read about humanists is they're atheists. And I said, well, historically, that's actually not true. There are many humanists that were what we call hybrids. They were very much involved in a religious system, that they were all the way from being very volunteering in it, all the way to being trapped in it. And they found great interest and overlap with humanism. So they became Christian humanists like Erasmus and others. And then in the Enlightenment, you have philosophers who are raised Christian, but they become very pragmatic ethicists, believe in utilitarian, that you don't have to have a God to be good. And you have writers that do this, but they still have some religious ties. And then you have these denominations like the Unitarians that are a liberal branch. Many of them are not theists, but they do believe in humanism, but they believe that Jesus was a very ethical genius in a way, that he set an example. So I usually say to them, you don't have to be anti-religious to be a humanist, but what you have to do is acknowledge that if your religion doesn't update and you're following an ethical system that's 3,000 years old, you're going to make some pretty big immoral decisions. Because these were sheep herders that wrote this Old Testament.
Yeah.
And the New Testament was written during the Roman era, in which the people attracted to Christianity were poor. They were widows. They were people who were outside of society, and the Romans persecuted them, right? And so all of that influenced your New Testament. All the stuff that you read about how faith is everything, and how humility and being a person who is meek, that's what's important, because that's who was attracted to Christianity in its first iteration, right? So you don't have to be anti-religious, just update your religion, please. Update it.
Oh, wow.
So, and they may also say, well, you don't believe in God, right? And I say, well, I can answer that question if you be kind enough to tell me who God is.
Mm-hmm.
Give me your description. Because, there are a lot of varieties.
That's true.
Right? Which one would you like to say is your foundational theism?
Mm-hmm.
So then they say, well, God is all loving. He's all knowing. He sent his son to die on the cross. And if you believe in him, you're saved and you'll have eternal life. That's the God I believe in. And then I say, okay, so he's a loving God. Do you have neighbors that aren't going to make it to heaven? Oh, yeah. I've got some Muslim friends next door. They're real cruel to their kids, and they're never going to be there. Oh, so you don't believe in Allah, right? No, I don't believe in Allah. Okay. Do you think those Muslims are going to be in heaven with you? No, I don't think so. Why would God, translated in another culture 600 years later, not count that you have to call me Jehovah, or you have to call me the God of the New Testament, or you have to call me Jesus? Otherwise, you're condemned to eternity in burning hell. Right? Is that a loving God? You believe in that God? Usually, then the conversation could be ended. Yeah. Because they don't have an answer to that. That's only if I feel they're a peer. I would never do that to a student. Of course. Because they're not going to stand up to that. So, and I don't want to proselytize as a chaplain. But if I'm just out in the public sphere, that I often have those kinds of, I don't often, but on occasion I have those conversations. So what do you do as a chaplain? Find their God first. Right. Yeah. So then what do you do as a humanist chaplain? Are you going into the hospital and visiting with people? Are you marrying people? What's happening? Well, I became a humanist chaplain at Kwantlen University, which has 2 campuses here. Well, they have 5, but they have 2 multi-faith centers in Surrey and Richmond. And I joined there in 2014, 2015. And this is after doing some lectures at SFU on humanism. And I basically meet with students, although we're a pretty small, new multi-faith center, and we don't have residences. So students all commute, so they're all very busy. But I do meet with students. I, on occasion, have met with faculty, and I've also lectured in some philosophy classes. And I think probably if you ask me what patients or what students have been the most difficult based on their religious indoctrination, I would say probably it's been the ministers that I've worked with, either in seminary and they're just getting started, or it is they're having problems in their marriage and they're thinking about divorce and they're in tremendous conflict about being divorced and staying in the church, particularly if they're a minister, right? Because then that is going to affect their career. Right. So I've had to work with that. That's probably the most kind of entangled religious scenarios that I've dealt with as a psychologist, because I have had ministers come to see me. They knew I went to Fuller and they think maybe there's something I can add. The other one has been at Kwantlen, and it has been the fact that we get a lot of South Asian students. Yes. We get a lot from Hong Kong, from Indonesia, from India, Punjab, Pakistan, and Turkey. And they come to our university, and they are, for the first time, beginning to see an entire secular curriculum. Wow. So they're reading philosophy. They're reading cultural anthropology. They're reading history. And so within this context, if they were a little bit like me and had a curiosity and were asking difficult questions in the mosque, or felt the mosque was kind of really old-fashioned, or the way they divided the men and the women, or having to do 5 prayers every day, if they had questions about that, they might come and talk to me as the humanist chaplain, because whenever I would give speeches to students, I would say I work with the secular students or the religious students who are struggling with staying in their faith, I want to provide a safe place for you to discuss that journey. And so I have had some very difficult conversations with Islamic students who are considering the possibility of leaving Islam behind, but they still live at home.
Right.
And if you understand anything about being a young Muslim in a home that believes heartily in Islamic system, if you were to go to your parents or tell one of your siblings that I don't know if I believe this shit anymore, blah, 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 you would be probably kicked out of the house. And if not kicked out, you would be ostracized terribly. And your support would be totally eradicated in that family. And if the community, if the mosque learns that, Abdul Jajon has a son that is wayward, they will also marginalize that whole family. And the family knows that. So if they want to stay in the faith and they still want to go to the mosque and be a part of the community, then they can't let that out. That is not something you would ever say. So working with these students, most of them they're either Hindu or they're Muslim, who are in very conservative families. And they have not many options. Right. And they have a lot more trauma potential than I ever had in Southern California and really able to live on my own. It's very different.
Yeah. Fundamentalism is ugly, whatever stripe it is. And really, when we see religion and culture deeply intertwined, it just makes it so much harder.
It's not updated. That's what fundamentalism is. It's relied on tradition for thousands of years. And the minute you make any tradition thousands of years old without any scientific or more experiential changes or cultural changes or travel or anything that see the world lives very differently than the way you do, then you have to end up really retrenching back to something that you can count on. And so they count on these holy books that they've trusted for thousands of years. And if you really read them and read them carefully, everything in them, there's some real challenges. And so the liberal movements often in these religions are ones that are scholars that have really looked at these books carefully as philologists and studied the language and studied the context and studied the interpretation errors. And they go, well, maybe this fundamentalism has got some real shaky parts to it here, right? And young people often are more liberal. They want something that's changing, that's updated. And so they struggle with that form of fundamentalism.
Oh, yes. And we certainly see some of this issue going on today in Iran as the women and the young people there are demanding some freedom from the religious oppression. And Marty, this has been so delightful and so interesting. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat with me. I know you mentioned that you've been doing some writing. Do you have a book coming out, or is there a place where people can find you or find your work?
I have 2 articles that are in books. I think I sent you one from the AHA site. I have one in a multi-faith book. It's kind of a dictionary of a lot of chaplains. And we have one that's going to come out next year, being published by Theo Bonderhoff, who is the research guy at BCHA, and he's a scientist that lives on the island. He's have a book that's coming out on secular themes, and we have an article in there on humanist chaplaincy. Wonderful. But the book you're talking about, I've been working on for 5 years, and just like our DNA, it's been evolving. It started off just as a book I could hand to somebody who said, what's a humanist chaplain? Right. Now it's expanded. And now that I'm on the humanist chaplaincy approval process and was honored with becoming the first humanist chaplain in Canadian history, I'm writing a book on humanist ambassadorship. And it has to do with taking all of these historical threads, pulling them together, making them contemporary, and then finding ways that we can influence our society by humanistic values. It's not anti-religious, and whether you are, agnostic or a free thinker or a liberal theist or whatever, you will find places in this book that you can find to either volunteer or find a career, at least part-time, where you can actually live out some of these humanistic values and really make the public sphere respond more than to this Christian nationalism and these strong voices that want to take us back thousands of years into an ethical system that, is sheep herder culture.
Yeah.
We have an information age here. We may have robots that are going to take over. So we have to update.
It's the truth. Oh my gosh. Well, I really look forward to the completion of that book. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today on the Divorcing Religion podcast. I encourage you to subscribe to the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel so you never miss an episode of the Divorcing Religion podcast. And if you're so inclined, I invite you to support me and my work on Patreon. Thanks again, Marty. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been great. Thank you very much.